I never thought a simple driveway would cause so much trouble. It all started when I moved into my new home. The house was perfect, quiet neighborhood, spacious yard, and a driveway wide enough for 2 cars. I had just finished unpacking and was settling in when I realized something strange. The neighbors, who were usually friendly, started giving me odd looks every time they walked by. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe I was just new to the area, or they were curious about the new neighbor. But then, one afternoon, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Karen, one of the HOA board members. Now, I had heard about her reputation. She was known for being extremely particular about every little detail of the neighborhood, always ready to enforce the most minor of rules. But what I didn't expect was for her to come to my door within the first few weeks of moving in. "Your driveway is too wide," she said bluntly, standing there with a look of complete disapproval on her face. She wasn't smiling, wasn't offering any kind of small talk, just stating it like it was some undeniable fact. I was taken aback. Too wide? I thought my driveway was perfect. It was just a driveway, right? I had never even considered that something as simple as a driveway could be a problem. I stood there confused, trying to make sense of it. "What do you mean, too wide?" I asked. "It's just a driveway." Karen, with her arms crossed, shook her head. "Well, it's causing a problem. It's out of place. The other driveways in the neighborhood are much smaller. Yours is too big, and it messes with the look of the neighborhood." I didn't know how to respond. "It's my property," I said, trying to keep things civil. "Why is it an issue if it's on my land?" But Karen wasn't interested in hearing my side. She went on about how the aesthetic of the neighborhood was being ruined, how my driveway didn't conform to the approved measurements set by the HOA. She even mentioned that it could be a traffic hazard because it made the street look too crowded. This, I found completely ridiculous. My driveway was not a public road. It was simply a place for me to park my cars. I could feel my frustration building up. The driveway had been built long before I moved in, and there had never been a problem with it. Why was it suddenly an issue? Karen's words kept hitting me, and I realized this wasn't about a driveway at all. It was about control. Karen and the HOA seemed to think they had the right to dictate every little thing on my property, and this wasn't going to be the last time I felt that pressure. She didn't stop there. Karen demanded that I reduce the width of my driveway to match the standard size of the other homes. If I didn't, she said, the HOA would take further action. I was stunned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wasn't going to just tear up my property for some minor aesthetic issue that didn't affect anyone but me. But Karen didn't care about my feelings, she had made up her mind. After our conversation, I thought maybe I could just ignore it. Perhaps Karen was just overreacting. I didn't want to deal with an HOA conflict right away, but the very next day, I received a letter from the HOA. It was official, printed on their letterhead, and it made things crystal clear. I was in violation of the neighborhood guidelines. The letter stated that my driveway did not conform to the approved measurements and that I needed to reduce it to the size the HOA deemed appropriate. At the end of the letter, they included a stern warning: if I didn't comply, they would impose fines. I couldn't believe it. This was getting out of hand. The letter made it clear that they were serious, and I started to realize that Karen's issue with my driveway wasn't just about a minor inconvenience, it was about the HOA pushing their power and control. I wasn't going to back down without a fight. I decided to stand my ground. I began researching the HOA rules, property rights, and the legal limits of what they could and couldn't do. I wasn't just going to tear up my driveway to meet their standards without a fight. The more I learned, the more I realized how much the HOA overstepped its boundaries. I also started hearing rumors from other neighbors. Some people told me that Karen had been doing this for years, nitpicking and forcing her will on anyone she could. I wasn't the first person to get caught in her crosshairs. As the pressure mounted, I knew I had to take this issue seriously. I wasn't about to let Karen or the HOA get away with this. It was my property, and I wasn't going to let them push me around. So, I started taking action. I consulted with a lawyer to make sure I had all the facts. I was determined to stand up for my rights, and I wasn't going to let a simple driveway cause me to lose control of my property. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of what would turn into a long, frustrating battle. After receiving the letter from the HOA, I knew things were about to get a lot more serious. The thought of dealing with fines was frustrating, but I wasn't about to let that pressure make me cave in. I started looking into the laws surrounding property rights and HOA regulations. I knew that in the end, they couldn't just dictate what I did on my own land without good reason. I was determined to fight this, but I had to prepare myself. I went over every detail of the HOA's complaint, dissecting their claims. The more I researched, the more I realized that they were relying on vague guidelines that didn't hold up in a legal sense. I discovered that HOA rules often don't have the power to affect things like the width of a driveway unless there's a specific, written agreement or covenant that ties the property to those restrictions. And I was confident that no such agreement existed on my property. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to take a bold step. I hired a lawyer to represent me. I wasn't about to let this escalate without legal support, especially after learning how much control the HOA could potentially exert. My lawyer quickly reassured me that I had the legal right to maintain my property as I saw fit, including the driveway. They told me the HOA could not force me to make any changes unless it was clearly stipulated in the community rules, and from everything I could see, it wasn't. Feeling more confident, I drafted a letter to the HOA, explaining my position. I calmly outlined the legal points that supported my right to keep the driveway as it was. I also included a copy of the property deeds, which clearly stated that I owned the land and had the full authority to manage it as I wished. I wasn't sure how the HOA would respond, but I knew it was time to stand up for myself. The very next day, I sent off the letter and waited. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I felt a sense of relief knowing I was taking the right steps. However, as the days passed, I started to realize that this wasn't going to end peacefully. Karen wasn't done with me, and neither was the HOA. It wasn't long before I received another letter. This time, the tone was even more aggressive. The HOA insisted that my driveway violated neighborhood harmony and threatened even harsher penalties. They were even talking about demolishing the entire driveway and rebuilding it to their specifications. I was in shock. How could they think they had the right to demolish part of my house? This was beyond ridiculous. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I had to keep my cool. I decided that if they were going to escalate things, I would do the same. I called my lawyer again and told him about the new threats. He immediately took action, gathering more evidence to ensure that the HOA had no legal standing in their demands. I started documenting everything, every letter, every phone call, every interaction with Karen and the HOA. If this was going to go to court, I wanted to be prepared. But just when I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. One afternoon, I came home from work to find a city inspector standing in front of my house, clipboard in hand. I was immediately alarmed. The inspector said he was there to evaluate my driveway, under the orders of the HOA. I was taken aback. How could they have sent someone without my consent? This was my property. I had a right to decide who stepped onto it. I asked the inspector for his credentials, but he seemed unfazed. "I've been sent here by the HOA," he said. "They've filed a complaint about the width of your driveway, and we're here to make sure everything is up to code." I was furious but kept my composure. "You can't just come here and inspect my property without my permission," I told him firmly. "I haven't agreed to any inspection. The inspector tried to argue, but I stood my ground. Eventually, he backed off and left. As I closed the door, I realized just how far Karen and the HOA were willing to go. They weren't just threatening fines anymore, they were actively trying to intimidate me into submission. Later that night, I went through my legal options again with my lawyer. We agreed that this was a blatant overstep by the HOA, and we were prepared to take them to court if necessary. But even as I prepared for a legal battle, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to give in to their demands. This was my property, and I would fight for it no matter what. The tension continued to build, and I could sense that Karen was becoming even more determined to get her way. I braced myself for the next round of confrontation. But one thing was clear: this wasn't just about a driveway. This was about setting a boundary, letting the HOA know that I wouldn't let them control my life or my home. As the days went on, the pressure continued to mount. The HOA, through Karen, wasn't letting up. I kept receiving increasingly aggressive letters, each one more demanding than the last. They were insistent on my driveway being reduced in size, threatening legal action, and even threatening to take the case to court. At the same time, Karen seemed to be everywhere, showing up at neighborhood meetings, talking to neighbors about my violation, and spreading rumors that I was defying the HOA and causing trouble for everyone. I could see the tension building, not just with the HOA but within the neighborhood as well. Neighbors started approaching me, asking if I was really going to fight the HOA. Some of them were sympathetic, others seemed unsure about whether I was causing unnecessary drama. But Karen was good at twisting the narrative. She had a way of making herself seem like the hero in all of this, claiming that I was being unreasonable and that everyone else was suffering because of my too-wide driveway. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about a physical space anymore, it was about community dynamics, control, and Karen's own personal power within the HOA. One evening, as I was coming back from the store, I spotted Karen standing near my driveway, speaking to another neighbor. As soon as she saw me, her face twisted into a look of pure disdain. She started walking toward me with an air of authority, clearly expecting me to be intimidated. "You're really going to fight us over this, aren't you?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You know this is going to make things much worse for you, right? The HOA has the power to make your life miserable." I tried to stay calm, but it was hard. "It's my driveway, Karen. It's legal, it's not harming anyone, and I'm not going to change it just because you say so." She scoffed. "You're making a huge mistake. People are talking. You don't want to end up on the HOA's bad side." I stood my ground, refusing to let her get to me. But inside, I felt frustrated. Why was she so obsessed with my driveway? Why was she trying to make me feel guilty for standing up for my rights? A few days later, things took a turn for the worse. I came home to find a letter from the HOA that wasn't like the others. This one was different. It was an official notice stating that they would be taking further action. The letter claimed that I was in violation of not just the driveway guidelines, but also of community harmony. It was threatening fines, and worse, legal action if I didn't comply with their demands to alter the driveway. It also mentioned that the issue was now a formal complaint being brought before the entire HOA board for a vote. This was it. They were pushing harder than ever, and I realized that this could escalate even further. I had to prepare for the worst. I immediately called my lawyer and explained the situation. We needed to be ready. The lawyer reassured me that they had no legal grounds to force me to change anything, especially not the width of my driveway, but it was clear that this battle was not going to be an easy one. Karen and the HOA were going to fight tooth and nail to get what they wanted. They had made it personal. I decided that I wasn't just going to take the letters and threats lying down. I was going to confront this head-on, and I needed to gather more evidence. I started documenting everything I could, taking photos of my driveway from every angle, recording interactions with Karen and the HOA, and even speaking to my neighbors about the issue. I knew I had to be fully prepared if it came down to a legal battle. The last thing I wanted was for the HOA to drag me through months of court hearings, but if that's what it took to protect my property and my rights, then I would go through it. But as I began preparing for the inevitable court case, something unexpected happened. Karen and the HOA board began to step up their efforts. One evening, I was watching TV when my phone rang. It was my lawyer again. "We have a problem," he said. "Karen's pushing this too far. She's contacted the local news about your driveway and is making this a bigger issue than it needs to be." My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. Karen was trying to turn it into a public spectacle, one that could make me look like the villain in the eyes of the whole community. The last thing I wanted was the media involved, but I knew I had no choice. I had to fight this on every front, even if it meant the situation would become even more public. I agreed to let my lawyer handle things and immediately started making preparations to stand up for myself at the upcoming HOA board meeting. I was ready to present all the evidence I had, and I wasn't going to let Karen turn me into the bad guy. I had to show the HOA that I wasn't just going to roll over and give in to their demands. As the board meeting approached, I found myself nervous but determined. I had been backed into a corner, and this was my chance to fight back. It was time for the HOA to realize that their authority over my driveway was not only unreasonable but also illegal. The day of the HOA board meeting arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. This was it, the moment I would either stand my ground or watch as the HOA took control of my property. The thought of facing Karen and the entire board was intimidating, but I knew I had to do this. I had prepared every piece of evidence I could, photos of my driveway, documentation proving I had the legal right to use and maintain it as I saw fit, even testimony from my lawyer stating that the HOA had no legal basis to force me to make any changes. I arrived at the HOA office early. The building was modest but had an air of authority to it. As I walked inside, I could feel the tension building. Several board members were already seated around a long table, and Karen was sitting at the head, looking smug and self-assured. She barely acknowledged me as I entered, but I could tell she was ready for a fight. The meeting began with the usual formalities. The board president stood up and introduced the issue, my driveway. He briefly described how my driveway violated the community guidelines, mentioning Karen's complaints about the aesthetic disturbance it caused. Then he called on Karen, who stood up and began speaking with a confident tone. "This driveway is too wide," Karen said, her voice cutting through the room. "It doesn't fit with the rest of the neighborhood. It's an eyesore, and it's causing traffic issues. It's time for this to be dealt with. It's not just a minor problem anymore, it's a serious concern for the safety and unity of our community." I could feel my blood boiling, but I had to stay calm. She was exaggerating everything, making it sound like my driveway was some kind of public menace. As she spoke, I noticed a few board members nodding along, but I could also see some of them exchanging glances, looking uncertain. When she finished, it was my turn. I stood up and addressed the room. "I understand that some people in this neighborhood may not like the size of my driveway," I began. "But the truth is, it's my property, and I've done nothing wrong. My driveway is perfectly legal. It doesn't cause any problems, and it's not a traffic hazard. I've done my research, and I have every right to maintain it as it is." I could see a few board members start to look a little uncomfortable. Karen wasn't expecting this level of resistance. She was used to people folding under pressure, but I wasn't about to let that happen. "I've gathered documentation to show that the HOA doesn't have the authority to demand changes to my property," I continued. "I have legal papers showing that this is my land, and no amount of complaints can change that. I've even spoken to my lawyer, and he's assured me that I am within my rights to keep my driveway as is." I handed out copies of the documents to the board members, making sure they could see the facts for themselves. I also mentioned the threats I had received, including the inspection of my property without my consent. I made it clear that this wasn't just about a driveway, it was about the HOA trying to exert control over something they had no right to touch. The board members looked over the documents and began murmuring among themselves. I could tell that they weren't convinced by Karen's arguments anymore. They were realizing that she was pushing for something unreasonable, and they were starting to question whether they could even enforce it. Karen was visibly frustrated. She shot me a glare and tried to interrupt, but I wasn't about to let her derail the meeting. "I've already explained my side," I said, standing firm. "This is my property, and I won't allow anyone, including the HOA, to dictate how I use it. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm simply asking for the right to maintain my property in peace." At that moment, one of the board members, a man in his mid-50s who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "We need to consider whether or not we have any legal grounds to demand this change," he said. "From the information we've been given, it seems like this isn't something we can force. If the driveway is legally within the bounds of the property and doesn't violate any laws, then we might be overstepping our authority." The room fell silent. Karen's face turned bright red with anger. She had been so sure of herself, but now she was starting to realize that the board wasn't going to just blindly follow her demands. After some back-and-forth discussion, the president of the HOA asked for a moment to confer with the board members. As they spoke privately, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. My argument was gaining traction. It felt like I was finally being heard, and Karen's grip on the situation was slipping. When the board returned, the president stood up and made a statement. "We've reviewed the legalities, and we've considered the evidence presented by both sides. It's clear that the HOA does not have the legal authority to demand any changes to your property. Therefore, we will respect your rights as the homeowner, and no further action will be taken regarding your driveway." I could hardly believe it. I had won. The HOA was backing down. But the victory wasn't without its cost. Karen, still fuming, stormed out of the room, muttering something under her breath. It was clear that she wasn't happy with the outcome, but there was nothing she could do. The decision had been made. I left the meeting feeling a mixture of relief and triumph. I had stood my ground, and I had won. The HOA had backed off, and I had proven that I wasn't going to let anyone take control of my property. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Karen wouldn't give up easily, but for now, my driveway was safe. In the days following the HOA board meeting, things settled down for a while. I had won the battle, but Karen and the HOA were not people who took defeat lightly. While the official decision was made in my favor, Karen's pride had been bruised, and I knew she wouldn't let this go easily. Still, the immediate pressure was off. The HOA had officially acknowledged that they had no right to force me to alter my driveway, and I could finally breathe a little easier. But even as I enjoyed a brief sense of peace, I couldn't help but notice a few subtle shifts in the neighborhood. Some of my neighbors, who had previously been neutral, started acting a little distant. I overheard a couple of conversations at the mailbox where people were asking questions about the issue, some even suggesting that I was making the whole situation worse. I knew Karen had been spreading her narrative, painting me as the troublemaker who refused to comply with community guidelines. I had to remind myself that I wasn't the one who had caused this problem in the first place. Karen and the HOA were the ones overstepping their bounds. A few weeks later, I received yet another letter from the HOA, which was not a surprise. This time, however, the tone was different. It wasn't a demand for compliance, nor was it threatening fines or legal action. Instead, it was an apology of sorts. The letter stated that after reviewing the situation and receiving feedback from various board members, they had concluded that my driveway wasn't an issue and that they would no longer pursue any action regarding it. The letter also reminded me that, as part of the HOA, I was still expected to adhere to certain community guidelines. However, it was clear that they were walking on eggshells, acknowledging that they had pushed the issue too far and that I had every right to manage my property as I saw fit. While the apology was a welcome relief, I knew that Karen hadn't given up just yet. She wasn't the type to admit defeat so easily, and I could tell that her pride had taken a huge hit. A few days after the letter arrived, I had a run-in with her in the neighborhood. She was standing near my driveway, staring at it as though it were the biggest problem in the world. When she saw me walking toward her, she quickly turned, her face tight with frustration. "You've won this round," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't over. You've made things very difficult for the HOA, and I'm going to make sure they know this isn't the last time we deal with this issue." I wasn't intimidated. I had already been through the worst of it, and I had won. "You've already lost, Karen," I said, standing firm. "The HOA has no right to force me to change anything on my property. You need to accept that." Her face reddened with anger, but she didn't say anything else. Instead, she turned and walked away, muttering under her breath. It was clear that she wasn't finished, but I was ready for whatever she threw my way. Over the next few months, Karen kept her distance, but I could tell she was still watching me. Every now and then, I would catch her lurking in the neighborhood, trying to catch a glimpse of my driveway or talking to neighbors about the situation. But as time passed, her influence began to wane. People were starting to realize that she had overstepped, and her attempts to control everyone's lives were starting to backfire. Eventually, I received a final letter from the HOA, confirming that they would no longer pursue any further action regarding my driveway. Karen had, in the end, been forced to back down. I had won the battle, and with the HOA's final concession, I knew the matter was finally closed. Looking back, I couldn't believe how much of a struggle it had been. It wasn't just about a driveway, it was about standing up for my rights and not allowing someone to push me around. I had learned so much about property ownership, HOA regulations, and how far some people would go to impose their will on others. It wasn't an easy fight, but in the end, I had emerged victorious. As for Karen, I haven't seen much of her since. I'm sure she still holds a grudge, but I don't let that bother me. My driveway is still exactly as it was when I moved in, and I can finally enjoy my property in peace. The whole ordeal left me with a new appreciation for standing up for what's mine, no matter how small the issue may seem to others. The neighbors who had initially been unsure about the situation have mostly moved on, and now, when I look at my driveway, I see not just a place to park my cars, but a symbol of perseverance. The HOA learned that they couldn't control every aspect of my life, and Karen learned that she couldn't intimidate me into submission. It was a long, hard fight, but in the end, I had successfully defended my property. And that was something I would never back down from. I still think about Karen from time to time, but now it's with a sense of relief that she's no longer in control. The HOA may have caused some headaches, but I've learned how to navigate these situations, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. At least now, I can park my cars in peace, knowing that my property is truly my own.